Let's begin. Hello and welcome to everybody. Today, GIZ FABRIC is hosting two experts on due diligence and how it could shape purchasing practices. My name is Stephen Frost and I'm your moderator today, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of GIZ FABRIC Asia. This is our third online seminar on due diligence this year, and it's our third on purchasing practices. Both of them are hot topics with existing laws and bills under preparation and development on both sides of the Atlantic, and there's more and more scrutiny on the impact of brands' purchasing practices. So today's event will bring those two themes together in the context of the EU Commission's proposal for a corporate sustainability due diligence directive, although not just talking about that, but we will certainly be focusing on that. Now, before I introduce our two expert speakers, bear with me for a minute while I do a bit of housekeeping. I know you're all probably familiar with Zoom, and if you can use Zoom, then you can use WebEx. If you do have a problem with WebEx, just type a question into the chat box, and there is an IT team behind this event who can help you out. So if you are having problems, just reach out to the IT team, and I'm sure they can help you. Second, this event is being recorded and the recording will be made available online. If you registered, then you will receive an email with a link in about a week or so. If you didn't register, then you won't be on our mailing list, but if you email GIZ, you'll be able to get access to the PowerPoints, the slides that are being shown in the event today. And a link to the recording. Another issue is that you are all in listen-only mode, but if you want to ask questions, then you'll need to type them in the comments box. We do encourage questions. We certainly encourage questions while speakers are speaking. And then as moderator, if I can insert that question into the discussion as we go along, that's brilliant. I will do so. If I can't do that, we will have Q&A time at the end. We've got plenty of time for Q&A, so if you do have questions, just type it into the box and we'll eventually get to it. Don't worry about that. If your question is directed to a specific speaker, please just name, this question is for Rachel or for Alexander, so I can direct that question to them. And finally, we do have a little survey poll towards the end of this event. The IT people will put a link into the chat box. We would appreciate it very much if you could take the time to click on the link and just do a very, very short survey poll. It really helps us to think about how we can make these online seminars better and more geared or tailored to the audience interests. Now to our panelists. Without any further ado, our first panelist is Rachel Davis. Rachel is the Vice President and co-founder of SHIFT, and SHIFT is an organization which is a leading center of expertise on the United Nations Guiding Principles on Human Rights. At SHIFT, Rachel has led work in the last decade on integrating the UNGPs into national and industry standards and into corporate practice across a wide range of sectors, including financial institutions. And she now leads SHIFT's work to drive alignment with the UNGPs into the development of mandatory due diligence laws. So she's really in the thick of things here. She's been a legal advisor to the former Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General on Business and Human Rights, that's Harvard Professor John Ruggie, and she played a pivotal role in helping develop the UNGPs. She's also a Senior Program Fellow with the Corporate Responsibility Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School in the US. Our second panelist is Alexander Konstam, Executive Director of Fairware. Alexander has served as Fairware's Executive Director since 2018, bringing to that organization 25 years of experience with development and international business. Prior to Fair Wear, Alexander held directorial positions at organisations working in a variety of areas, including the economics of health in Africa. His focus has always been on galvanising the private sector for human development. So welcome to both of you, and thank you for your time today. Before we really, so the topic of this online seminar is, to what extent will due diligence legislation shape purchasing practices, and how can suppliers have a voice? But before I get into the substance of that discussion, I'd really like to put a question to both of the panelists, and ask if they can set the stage by explaining what the terms due diligence and purchasing practices mean, so that we're all on the same page, so that we start this discussion all from the same point. And can I just start with you, Rachel, asking about due diligence?
Sure. Thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks to the organisers of the event for the invitation to join you all. I'm joining from Australia, so it's always nice to do things that are on a good time zone. And this is a really important discussion, as you've said, Stephen, and happy to be part of it together with Alexander. But let me answer your question. A technical definition of due diligence, or human rights due diligence, which is really our focus today, is straightforward. It's a process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for a company's negative impacts on people, specifically on people's human rights. But to maybe give a little more flesh to that, there are 5 points that I'd just like to call out that I think are important to keep in mind when we talk about human rights due diligence. The first and most important is that while the steps may be familiar to anyone who carries out due diligence for other types of business process, so identifying risks, taking action on them, tracking the effectiveness of your actions and communicating about them, what is different with human rights due diligence is the focus on risk to people rather than risk to the business. Those things may overlap, but we're really looking for a distinct focus on risk to people here. The second point I'd make is that because we're looking at risks to people, engagement with people, and specifically with the people who may be affected, is central to human rights due diligence. It's essential if you're going to prioritize where to put your attention as a company, because you can't do everything at once. Then you need to go after those impacts that may be most severe for people, which means having their perspectives in the mix of your decision making. And that's also important to understand the effectiveness of your actions. Third point of emphasis about human rights due diligence is that while the goal, of course, is to seek to prevent harms, impacts, it recognises that that's not always possible, and that there's a need for remedy when harms occur. And that has a very particular meaning in human rights due diligence. Remedy is about putting the person who's affected, so a worker, a member of a local community, back in the position they were in before the harm occurred, or as close to that as possible. Now, that could involve financial remedy. So, for example, repayment of recruitment fees, where there's a policy prohibiting them, and yet it turns out workers have paid them, as they so often are forced to, essentially. But it goes well beyond financial issues, and it's not just about financial compensation. It can involve reinstating someone who's been wrongly dismissed. It can involve an apology. It can involve a range of different measures. So that's different, I think, also from our normal understanding of due diligence. Fourth point is that what you're expected to do as a business depends on how you're involved with an impact, whether you cause or contribute to it, or whether you're linked to it through a business relationship. We can talk more about that later, but it's an expectation of reasonable action to try to prevent and address harm. It's not expecting companies to magically fix everything. And the final point is that due diligence is a set of processes, but it's processes that have to be embedded in a broader set of internal accountability and governance measures, and of course, ultimately in a broader corporate culture. So it's not something that can just be siloed, separate from the business model or strategy.
Yeah, that's great. Alexander, could you add something on the implications of due diligence for the garment sector specifically?
Well, the garment sector is an interesting sector, I must say, with its own characteristics that also directly link to why OECD-based due diligence, I would say, is so important. I'm mentioning the OECD specifically because they've worked out the UNGP so well, especially for our sector, that it would really be very bad if we'd have alternative standards or alternative interpretations of standards. There are very, very good guidelines from the OECD on how to apply due diligence in the garment sector and also in other sectors. And it's important that, you know, globally we use the same type of guidelines and ways of working, especially with legislation coming up or already there indeed, because in Germany the legislation is already there and will be effective from 1st of January. So the garment sector, let me say a few things that are particularly relevant for this discussion. I think the garment sector is unique because it's so fragmented. I think that's a really important point. It's fragmented both on the market side, lots of brands, lots of retailers, and on the production side, lots of suppliers in the different tiers also. So very fragmented value chain. It's highly competitive, highly price competitive. That's also something that I think we should realize. And a third element is a very high extent, high fungibility of labor. So it's relatively easy for a lot of products to switch from one factory to another factory, or even from one country to another country, if you think that that's better for your business. Now, if you combine that with the fragmentation on both sides and with the price competitiveness, it means that there is a high level of, let's say, promiscuity in our sector, where brands go from one factory to another, or even from one country to another, which makes it difficult for factories and countries to invest in human rights, in working conditions, in environmental conditions, because they're never quite sure whether their customers will be there the next day, or whether they will hop on to a cheaper factory if their supplier invests, and of course then needs to raise some of the prices. So this is a stranglehold, sort of a prisoner's dilemma, I guess, that means that due diligence legislation and the collaboration that comes with due diligence obligations, I think we'll probably get into that a little bit later, but you need to collaborate to do good due diligence in a fragmented sector. That legislation and collaboration are imperative for our sector.
So I'll just stick with you, Alexander. So due diligence, what about purchasing practices? Do you want to just outline
Sure.
what purchasing practices means here?
Sure, and I think this is, so I also want to thank the organizers for this opportunity, because it's really necessary in this highly fragmented value chain that brands and suppliers work together in partnerships, in long-term partnerships, rather than the sort of inequitable relationships, sometimes exploitative, I would say, relationships that exist at the moment. And purchasing practices are an integral part of that. So the current situation is often that brands rely on certificates or on factory audits. And you know, companies send in a group of auditors into a factory, and they said, oh, the factory is good or bad, basically, or there are a few things to improve, or it's often rather predictable, I should say. There are some good ones, sure, but very often there may be less than what we should expect, or less than effective. But more problematically, if that's the only thing you rely on, you skip over your own purchasing practices, because you say, well, I've done my due diligence because I only work with the good factories. Well, that's not how it works. Most of the problems in the factories are caused by the brand's behavior, not by the factory behavior. Of course, you have bad factory owners who do bad things, and managers, but most of the structural problems, whether it's overtime, wages, all of that, the big problems in the garment supply chain, they're mostly caused by the brand's behavior, or can at least be solved by brand behavior.
Right, caused or solved, yes. So, Rachel, you started off with kind of a theoretical definition of due diligence. Maybe you could follow up on the purchasing practices, and we mentioned UNGP and OECD's being mentioned there. Maybe you could talk a little bit about in the context of those two.
Sure, and Alexander rightly stressed the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and then the guidance that's been developed under that specifically for the garment sector. And it's important because back in 2011, way back, it now seems, when we were working on the UNGPs, we worked very closely with the OECD to ensure that these two international standards essentially were very closely aligned. So human rights due diligence in the UNGPs and in the OECD guidelines really match extremely closely. And that's very important because the last decade has seen a growing number of companies invest in that international standard. And so for companies that are serious about human rights due diligence and are trying to both, use leverage and influence with their partners, but also to the point of purchasing practices, change their own behavior as well to try to ensure that this is effective, that's what they've been aligning with. So it's really important now as we start to move towards mandatory measures, and the guiding principles always envisioned that there would be mandatory measures, that there would be laws of different kinds, and eventually to require due diligence as we're now seeing. So it's not that that's unexpected, it's just that now it's happening. It's really important that align as much as possible with the international definitions. And that's for a few reasons. First of all, it's because the international standards are clear that this responsibility to do due diligence and to seek to prevent and address harms to people is a responsibility of all companies. And it's not about offloading it. It's not like someone gets to offload their responsibility to someone else by putting it in a contract and you sort of wipe your hands. It's really about looking at how together with your partners there are risks and what you can do individually, jointly to address them. And again, the point Alexander was making, to address them over time, because many of these, as we know, are systemic issues. Of course, they also involve government policy, they involve formal law, but they also involve practice, they involve wages, they involve things that you can't change overnight. And so what the international standards encourage is engagement with partners, engagement with governments, engagement in trying to get better contexts and better business relationships for achieving respect for human rights in practice. And that requires time, and it requires investment in the relationship, time as well as potentially financial, of course. And we know that we need that because when we don't get that, we see cutting and running. We see sort of either exiting challenging relationships, exiting challenging markets. And exit has a place in the international standards, but it's a version of exit that is responsible. And it shouldn't be the first answer. It's not about when we see a problem, we quickly switch, or we go somewhere where we think there might be fewer problems, because you don't tend to get to human rights change by constantly switching and exiting from relationships. So this point about engagement is really essential. And I guess the other reason why we need to see alignment in the mandatory standards that are coming out is because we now have over a decade of very practical experience, and particularly in this sector, which, as Alexander has said, has some structural challenges, I think, in trying to make this kind of model work. But we do have experience that shows that command and control and policing style approaches and cutting and running generally leads to worse outcomes for people, for workers, for local communities. And it's not what we know we need as a way forward. So if, as the international standards are translated into law, if we're not capturing what's different about human rights due diligence, some of those factors I was mentioning before and what we're talking about now, then we're going to basically miss the benefit of a decade plus of experience by many people, including, I'm sure, many on the line today, with what works and what doesn't. And that's why we're certainly putting a lot of emphasis on this at Shift.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of terms there. I think everybody knows what cut and run means, cutting and running. But one of the terms that you mentioned was command and control. Can you just explain what you mean by command and control?
Sure. Really, I guess a top-down, compliance-based approach. And I don't mean to suggest that compliance is bad. We need compliance. It's an essential function. But an approach that is based purely on setting expectations, for example, in a supplier code, putting that in a contract that a brand essentially says to a supplier, sign the contract if you want the business. There's no negotiation. And then expecting that through a process of audits to check whether compliance is in fact occurring will magically achieve the outcomes and the expectations that have been set. Now, that may be possible in a situation where the brand itself doesn't do anything to change the dynamics or to change the reality on the ground. And that's where the purchasing practices aspect becomes so important, of course, that there may be things that a company itself does. In fact, there are things the company itself does in the case of purchasing practices that can influence the feasibility of its partner meeting those expectations. So I think what we've really seen is through the international standards, this recognition that command and control and sort of saying from on high, this is what needs to be done on the ground, over here in country X, has not, we know now, it does not deliver the results we want for people. And so we need to change our approaches. And I think many leading companies have indeed been trying to do that.
Yeah, one of the inferences I'd make listening to you here is there's that sort of command and control idea really pushes responsibility down onto the supply chain. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So Alexandra, I've spoken to lots of people who work with you. We've never met before today, but I've certainly have a close relationship with some of your team. And one of the terms I've heard where people talk about is supply chain responsibility. Is what Rachel's talking about here what you mean by that?
It's been good talking to you, and I think discussions with GIZ, the larger GIZ, and I think in general the involvement of the German government in the garment sector, in responsible behavior in the garment sector is really has been really important. Is still really important to promote the different concepts, and indeed also the German legislation will affect brands and suppliers already now. Brands in Germany are now preparing for that, and it's really important that suppliers also start to understand what due diligence means for them. Partly the due diligence that they do in their supply chain, as it were, but Rachel would know much better than me to explain about that. But mostly, I think, from my point of view, mostly on what their customers, their brands are going to ask of them under the new regulations, because there is a big difference between showing a certificate or allowing an auditor to come and do a check, for better or for worse. It is very different to be involved in the due diligence obligations of your clients. And that requires, I think, a much more supply chain approach with shared value and shared responsibility as well. And that's indeed what our teams are working on. So we have about 50 people in Europe, in Germany and Holland especially, but also we have teams in 11 production countries, and we're trying to bridge that gap, because there is a big gap. There are unequitable relationships. People often don't even know each other. There are agents in between, which sometimes works, but is very often a very bad thing for the relationships. And we need supply chain responsibility in the sense that the responsibility is also shared and not, as Rachel said, offloaded by the brand to the rest of the supply chain. That's a crucial concept, and it's not only something that's in the interest of the suppliers. On the short term or short-sightedly, maybe people think, yeah, that's good for the suppliers because now they are given the responsibility, but not the tools or the money to do anything with that responsibility, and that's true. But it's also in the benefit of the brands. Sustainable businesses are not only businesses that care about whether they have solar panels on their roofs in their main office in Berlin or in Amsterdam, but that are about sustainability throughout the supply chain, following a risk-based approach. And sustainable companies are also resilient companies. And I think that we have really seen also during the pandemic, for example.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to this what happened in the pandemic. So maybe we could just backtrack a bit and really to ask you both, I suppose. I mentioned in my brief intro that we've done several online seminars on due diligence. We've done several online seminars on purchasing practices. We've covered issues. We've covered the German due diligence law that Alexander's just talked about. We had an online seminar looking at the rise of legislation, that for the last 25, nearly 30 years now, it's we've had a set of voluntary initiatives, and that's starting to change now with the rise of legislation. And when we talk about purchasing practices, we were talking about the ways in which companies purchase, the ways that's changed over the last 15 or 20 years, and is still changing. And we've had an online seminar about the issue of arbitration. So what do suppliers do when they're not paid for orders completed? And so in the context of all that, let's just back up a little bit and for both of you, why are we talking about this today? What makes this so important right now? Why has this, in 2022, why are we here now? Maybe Rachel, you could start with that. Why are we talking about due diligence and purchasing practices now?
Sure. I mean, two reflections. Humans we often take our time, right, to get to what we should be addressing. And I think there's been a very strong sense that this development is actually a bit late in coming, looking specifically at how we turn these expectations into legislation. It's the role of governments and states to look at where, voluntary policies are important, but are not achieving the right outcomes for people in terms of human rights protection. So that pressure, I think, has been there for some time, and it's really built in the last decade. Now that we've got consensus about what do we expect due diligence to look like, and what's the purpose of due diligence from a human rights perspective. At the same time, we've seen, and COVID has only compounded this, massive growing inequality. And when we look at the challenges, the twin challenges really of climate change and inequality that confront us today, I think the pressure, and we see this reflected at least in the region, in the EU, in broader EU policy, that the social complement to addressing climate change has now really risen up the focus of the of EU policy making and rulemaking, and that a lot of this, which was grounded in the EU's green commitments and green agenda, is now really bringing the social together with the environmental. And while our discussion here has been mostly about human rights due diligence, it's important that the EU proposal is about human rights and environmental due diligence. And also has a specific provision talking about climate change transition planning as well. And that increasingly, I think we're going to see, environment bringing the social part with it. And of course, we would say they're equally important. It's not about valuing one or the other. It is about making them more integrated over time.
I think this is a good opportunity then, just to reflect a little bit on, you mentioned the EU Commission's proposal. Maybe you can just give us a little overview of I'm sure many people in the audience have heard of the EU Commission's draft proposal. They may have even downloaded it and opened it, but I doubt if very many of us on the call have read it cover to cover. Maybe you could give us a little overview of that, so we all know what we're talking about.
I'm happy to. For those who have day jobs that don't involve downloading and reading EU legislation,
yeah.
which I assume is many of you. However, my day job does, so very happy to talk about it. And I might actually ask just George, the expert technician behind the scenes here, for your assistance, please. I'd love to bring up just a couple of slides because it might help people since we're talking about the content of regulation. And happy for these obviously to be shared with all participants afterwards. So just I wanted to share 3 slides. And the first one is just to briefly touch on what the directive itself says are its objectives, because I think, you know, whenever we start talking about rulemaking or legislation, we need to start from what the legislator says they're actually trying to achieve. And it's useful here just to, I think, particularly focus on a couple of the objectives. There are 5 that the Commission says that it has in making this proposal. The first is to improve corporate governance practices to better integrate sustainability risk management into corporate strategies. And that goes back to what I said at the start, that this is not just about some sort of siloed processes, you know, that one person sitting in a room at the end of the corridor somewhere in the company does. This is actually about corporate governance and corporate strategy. At least that's the objective of where the directive is trying to get to, and that's significant because that gets us into some more challenging questions, I think, when you try to work out what is the source of risk and what should we do about risk. The second objective is to avoid fragmentation of due diligence requirements. You both mentioned the national laws that are developing. There's a lot of concern from businesses, certainly businesses in or operating in the EU, that they're going to be competing requirements, and they want to see alignment with the international standard that I've been talking about. But it's important also to focus on objectives 3 and 4, because these are about increasing corporate accountability for harms and improving access to remedy for those who are harmed. And you see that in the content of the directive. This is not just about, sort of a box ticking exercise that nobody will ever check up on. There are actually some quite strong enforcement provisions that are proposed because in order to meet these objectives. If we go to the next slide, this is a quick summary of the main features of the directive, again, for those who haven't had a chance to read it. The most important and fundamental, and what we're talking about in this call, I think, is that it establishes a duty, or proposes a duty, for companies to undertake sustainability due diligence. That's what it's called. And as I said, that encompasses both human rights and environmental due diligence. And it covers, or the duty it would apply to companies' own operations, to their subsidiaries, and to a very controversial phrase, their established business relationships. And I see Alexander smiling because he knows this debate well also. It's very unlikely that this phrase and this concept is going to remain as it's been proposed. There's been a lot of pushback, and I think questions coming both from governments as well as from companies, as well as from NGOs. So if everybody equally has a concern with a concept, then probably that concept is going to change. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I also don't think we need to necessarily get into the weeds of it. The second main feature of the directive is its scope, that it applies to very large, which has a particular definition based on employees and turnover, EU and non-EU companies that operate in the single market, and to large companies in 3 higher risk sectors. And for today's conversation, importantly, that includes textiles. Third point, as I've just said, it provides for enforcement through some quite robust provisions, which is good. Civil remedies, so that means the ability to bring court cases for people who are harmed by a breach of the duty in EU courts. And also administrative oversight, so that's national regulatory bodies in all of the EU member states whose job it would be to oversee whether companies are meeting this duty. And they can do that whether or not there's an allegation that harm has occurred. So that's a fairly, yeah, as I said, robust approach to enforcement. There are some other features of the directive, but I think they're less relevant for our conversation today. I'd love to just jump to the last or the next slide. Here, I've just summarized what are the main features of the due diligence duty that's been proposed in the directive. And we've both, Alexandra and I have both been mentioning the OECD guidelines. And for those of you who are familiar with them, you'll see that this pretty closely tracks the 6 steps of the OECD due diligence process, which again, very similar to the UN guiding principles. Integrating due diligence into policies and governance, identifying impacts, preventing impacts, establishing and maintaining a complaints procedure, monitoring what you're doing, and publicly reporting on it. So the main features of the due diligence duty are familiar, and that's good. But it's once we get into the detail of some of the proposal, I think that we and others certainly have started to have some questions.
Can we just go back to the previous slide? Box 3
Yes.
provides for enforcement through civil remedies. I guess there's producers, manufacturers on the call today that are probably thinking, you know, if I'm a manufacturer in Cambodia or Bangladesh or Pakistan or India, what's going to be the process by which I could undertake or for another party undertake a course for civil remedy? Is there any talk about that in the?
Yes. I mean, this is all still up for debate because all we have is a draft proposal and it's going through the political negotiation process now. And I know we'll talk a bit more about that soon. But you know, the point here of civil remedies would be that individuals who are harmed, so that could include individuals obviously in countries outside the EU, would be able, if they fall within the scope of the directive, and if they frankly have the support and ability to do it, because it's extremely hard to bring a court case in any EU court for pretty much anyone. It's not an easy process. That they would be able to bring a claim in an EU court if it could be shown that one of the companies that is subject to this directive, so this will be EU headquartered brands, but also foreign brands that are large enough to be operating in and meet the definitions of operating in the single market. If it can be shown that that there is a connection between something one of those companies did and the harm that the person experienced. So there's a lot of steps and elements you would need to show, but I think some of the concerns that have come about, you know, what would this mean for court cases? I think often those concerns underestimate what I just said, that it is still incredibly hard to bring these kinds of cases. And at the moment, the draft directive is not really proposing to make major changes to accessibility to EU courts. So there's a lot of procedural and frankly cost and other issues, evidentiary issues, that I think mean that we're not talking about new sort of flood wave or opening the floodgates of litigation. That's not what this is about. In many cases, it's about clarifying causes of action that, or the ability to bring a claim, I should say, that may already exist under national law in different EU countries, but hasn't been tested.
Yeah, the reason I asked that was because we've had a previous online seminar where we discussed at depth the potential for arbitration for suppliers to be able to access arbitration. So for a Bangladeshi supplier to be able to use arbitration to get justice against a client in the UK who hadn't paid for products. And so when I saw that, was quite interesting. Alexander, do you have anything to sort of add there about the proposal, the EU Commission's proposal? Is there anything that Fairware would like to add?
Well, I think Rachel has already pointed out the most important things. I also don't want to forget about your earlier question on why are we talking about this now. I'd like to get back to that.
Yes. Okay.
Maybe staying on the proposal for now. I fully agree with the fact that it's very problematic, this term established business relationships. Interestingly enough, the complex the negative feelings around that are shared, indeed, as Rachel said, very broadly. Not only because it's vague, and companies don't like vagueness. Nobody likes vagueness when you're talking about regulation. But also because due diligence should be risk-based and not relationship-based. So on the one hand, you could say, well, focusing on established business relationships mean you can ignore, let's say, the tail end of your supply chain, the ones that you don't know so well, where actually the most harm could be done, or the most difficult things could be happening without you knowing. On the other hand, more from a business point of view, you could say, well, we're a high-risk sector. We need to look at even the non-established relationships from a risk point of view. And then on top of that, we're forced to still put a lot of effort into the established business relationships where we don't see a lot of risk happening. So it's actually from left to right, it's quite broadly supported. That is also a key element of difference from what Rachel explained is actual due diligence. Due diligence is risk-based, not relationship-based. Another key element is this offloading of responsibilities. There's still some room for offloading responsibility, which really shouldn't be there. Of course, everybody has a responsibility, including suppliers. Absolutely, it's not to say that they don't, but the responsibilities for due diligence under the European law are with the European company, and that's not something you can sort of contract away. Because as I said before, it should fully integrate the purchasing practices, and that's really something we should not underestimate. We did, for example, and then also get to that point on why now, if you allow me.
Yes, of course.
Recently we did at Fairware we did a study on the root causes for overtime, excessive overtime, which is of course one of the big problems in the garment sector. And I think our team identified 37 causes, and they're all neatly in a tool. You can find it on our website. You can make action plans on how to remedy those causes, and to then work with your supplier to reduce overtime. But if you look at those 37 causes, I think 33 of them came directly from the purchasing practices of the brand. So the way you do your purchasing practices, in all its complexity, whether it's when you order or how you order or what your design looks like, that's 90% of the causes. And the other causes could all be remedied by better purchasing practices. So again, purchasing practices are extremely important. Now, on this question of why now, I think there is, as Rachel said, there is a growing consensus. I think that's the achievement then of today. I'm sorry, I have somebody's drilling here apparently in the building. I hope it's not too much of an interference.
I can't hear.
Okay, good. The problem is that for a lot of time there was no consensus on a lot of issues. For example, when we talk about living wage, the first thing people would say is, do we have the anchor methodology or the Asia floor wage, or it's all so complex we don't know what to do. That's why on the MSI side, I would say that sort of type of organizations that we are, a multi-stakeholder initiative, we've really tried to band together much more in recent years. I've also personally done a lot of work on working together with other membership-based organizations like Amfori, SAC, ETI, to agree more on practical standards. So obviously in the UNGP and in the OECD guidelines, even though they're excellent, that you can't write down everything and anything in every sector, in every situation. So it is up to us as a sector and the sector support system, let's say, to work with the whole of the industry, including very much also trade unions and others, to come to practical implications of what we agree on. So, for example, we've made a common framework for responsible purchasing practices that is out there and is now going to be operationalized, but it's very broadly supported. I think certainly also something a legislator or a regulator would look at when cases are brought to them. There is growing consensus on how to provide access to remedy, which opens up, we have a very good access to remedy system for our members, but that's just a very small part of the business. We need much better access to remedy for workers in working in other supply chains. And I know that under the new law, that's also, of course, a requirement within the 6 steps that Rachel presented. It needs to be at a certain level, and it needs to be better than it is now. So more and more companies are now actually working on that and also wanting to work with their membership-based organizations on access to remedy. And that, again, is something you want to do collectively. So important things need collaboration. And now that there is much more consensus on how to do that, and there's much more willingness to collaborate also on our side of the fragmented supply chain, I think that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this now and why this is happening now and why there's enough consensus also to come to legislation.
Yeah, which makes. Did you want to say something, Rachel?
I was just agreeing with that and around. Yeah, I guess maybe coming back to the point about that you were raising, Alexander, about what the draft legislation says about what our expectations are of companies and how we would measure those. If I can just jump to that, Stephen, I think one of the challenges the Commission has had, and I certainly want to salute the Commission for coming finally up with a draft, which many people have been calling for some time now. And it's great that this is moving forward. I think everybody recognizes that. But one of the challenges they clearly had, as any legislator has, and this will be the same, in the US, where you've got several proposals at state level in the mix. We don't know whether or when we might see something at federal level, given the difficulty of getting agreements in Congress. But it's coming in other countries as well. Here in Australia, it will be debated too in the coming year. That whenever you mandate a due diligence standard, you have to work out how you're going to evaluate compliance with it. And it's very appealing to measure compliance through things that can be, seen and ticked off on a list, right? So have you put this in all your contracts? Have you audited all the people you put it in contracts with? Have you followed up, on the results of, did you have a plan to follow up on the results of the audit? So contracts, audits, plans, these are things that are measurable and therefore, on the surface, appealing as a way of assessing compliance. I think what we were saying before was that is starting to hit a wall when we know that those approaches on their own in practice, while they're very important, don't get you all the way to outcomes. They don't get you to changed results for workers. They don't get you to changed purchasing practices. They can potentially get you into some of that sort of cyclical behavior and investment of resources that isn't necessarily going anywhere, or not going where you need it to from a human rights perspective. And so I think what we've tried to do in our analysis of the draft is to say, well, look, we recognize the problem the Commission is trying to tackle, which is how do you evaluate compliance? But we're going to have to come up with, we collectively are going to have to come up with some better ways of evaluating compliance that go to issues like purchasing practices, that go to what kind of leverage and engagement approaches are you using, that go to what kind of investments are you making, that go to what kind of stakeholder engagement do you conduct? So not just audits, but are you using worker-centric assessments, and how do they really feature? So we put out, again, this is a fairly high level document, as Alexander says. It's hard to sort of, we've got to get the balance right between this is a general due diligence duty applicable to every sector and issues that we know are particular in certain sectors. But we put out a document that we call Signals of Seriousness, which really tries to point to what are some of the ways after a decade of experience that when we look at what companies are doing in general terms on due diligence, we would say that's more serious or less serious. That's more about trying to deliver outcomes. That's less about trying to deliver outcomes. And I think those are some of the factors that we're really looking to the Commission and to EU policymakers to integrate into a final version of the directive, to get us away from just the heavy focus on contract audit plans, things that are easy to measure but not necessarily the most meaningful in terms of action.
I've got a question here that I think I should insert straight away, from Adiba Afros. Thank you. He says, "Hi Rachel, you've noted that incorporating workers' perspectives is a key component of human rights due diligence tracking mitigation. Can you share examples of effective worker participation models, especially in the context of countries that have weak union representation?" And I think that would also be up Alexander's alley as well.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, as your Adiba, as your question rightly recognizes, if you have legitimate trade unions to work with, then you're in a much stronger position for achieving the objectives and frankly the outcomes that we want in due diligence. And that, of course, is the starting point. But where that doesn't exist, then yes, I just asked George actually to share one of the other links we have, which is to worker-centric assessments, to their role, which I just mentioned. And we have a couple of other resources that I can share as well. But I think, what we've seen again is companies increasingly using good faith efforts to try to bring worker perspectives more into the mix of due diligence efforts where direct engagement with trade unions is not possible, but also to continue to always have in mind that ultimately that is what we need to be striving for from a human rights and labour rights standard. It is respect for trade union rights. So happy to share a couple more resources, but also invite Alexander to share his thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. No, I completely agree. So it's also in the business interest to have good relationships with workers. As I said, unfortunately, a lot of and this has to do with the business model of many of the products. If the value of the product is low, the value of labor is also low. That's an unfortunate thing that's happening, and that has happened in our sector. I don't want to sound too old. I'm just over 50, but when I used to own a piece of clothing, I was going to wear it for a few years. I still do, more than a few years actually. But nowadays, it's not something you continue to use. Something you throw away quite quickly, or you dispose of some other way. And that I personally really believe that also links back to the value of labor. As we see more and more now, labor is becoming a problem. So there's a shortage of labor. And this is, of course, very different from region to region. And it also depends on the product. Because for some products, you need more skilled labor than for others. But I would really warn every supplier, and also especially every brand out there, that consumers want more and more quality products, also quality in a broad sense, so responsible products. You can't make quality products with people who are untrained, who are exchanged if they speak up, who are fired. You can't work with factories that don't want to listen to collective workers' voice. it is really in the interest of business as well. It's also in the interest of suppliers, of manufacturers, I should say. I know that some manufacturers also have bad experiences with trade unions. It happens, things go wrong, but those stories I think are inflated and are used as excuses not to interact with trade unions. And you should. Social dialogue, serious talks between management and workers. It contributes to harmony on the factory floor, to better quality, better productivity, better efficiency, better long-term relationships with your clients. So completely agree. Apart from the fact that worker rights are human rights, and some of the worker rights that we've been talking about are very basic human rights. Apart from that fact, it's also freedom of association and social dialogue are key to having long-term quality business.
Many of the people on the call will know that I run an online database of news stories. I put up about 30 or 40 news stories every day onto an online database, and they go into a newsletter that some of you probably subscribe to and get it once or twice a week. And just to echo Alexander's point about labour shortages and training, I think that's been one of the key themes I've picked up in the last, certainly this year, but towards the end of last year as well, was many of the important production countries are facing labour shortages in particular areas, both geographically and in the types of workers required at certain skill levels. And there's a number of major textiles and apparel manufacturing countries that are really starting to have to grapple with this issue. So it's certainly on the minds of not just employers, but also policymakers as well, particularly in places. I think of Vietnam for one, and Bangladesh has been talking about labour shortages in particular areas as well. Rachel, I want to come back. If Rachel and the IT team have been putting in various links, both Alexander and Rachel have been mentioning certain documents, and they've been putting links to those in the chat box. So if you're interested in some of the things,
I'll put the common framework in there as well that I mentioned.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so there's quite a bit going on there. But Rachel, I want to come back to this, the shifts analysis of the EU Commission's proposal for a corporate sustainability due diligence directive. I think you were alluding to this earlier on, but I've got a quote here where Shift says, "A clause in a contract can be an essential foundation for exercising leverage with a partner, but it is only a foundation. Companies need to consider their own potential contributions to adverse impacts. For example, whether their own purchasing practices make it harder for their partners to meet human rights commitments, and whether there are adequate incentives for a supplier to share rather than to hide problems from them." Now, when I read this, these two sentences leapt out at me from your document, because I've been involved in this area, for over 20 years, and this is something that I've been constantly involved in discussions, particularly from the production side, from the manufacturing side, and this. Can there be, are there adequate incentives for a supplier to share rather than to hide problems from them? I think has been a burning issue for a long time. Can you expand a little bit more on that? Tell us a little bit about the thinking, putting that in.
Absolutely, and I think it probably resonates for a number of folks on this call and in this sector, and people have been trying to tackle this, as you say, Stephen, for some time. you know, and it goes back to some of the points we were mentioning before about this is an approach. If we're going to get to outcomes for workers and others, we need an approach that is about engagement, that is about transparency, that is about recognizing mutual contributions to an unsatisfactory situation, and in fact can be much worse than unsatisfactory for the workers who are impacted, can be life-threatening. You know, so if we're trying to move to a different kind of way of working together on these issues, then we really need legislation that is going to support that practical momentum that is happening in some parts of the sector and amongst some brands and suppliers, absolutely, as it is in other sectors as well. And I think what, you know, we really want to see in a revised version of this draft is a move away from those kinds of, as I said, things that are measurable, but not necessarily going to be the most meaningful in getting to mutual, having that sense of mutual responsibilities with both parties essentially pulling their own weight to do what they can to try to achieve those better outcomes. And that is really integrated into the terms of the relationship from the start and into how the relationship is conducted. And, you know, I'm a lawyer myself by training, so I'm, you know, certainly the first to say that contracts are important. I would never say that they weren't, but we chose that language very deliberately. They are a foundation only. You need this in your contracts, but you need a lot more than that. What you really need is the relationship, and the way that relationship works is what's really going to matter. So it can be very hard to say to someone who's writing a piece of legislation in Brussels, you know, you need to think about the relationship. You know, this law needs to emphasize the nature of the relationship. That sounds very fuzzy, sounds all nice and warm and whatever, but how am I going to translate that into a piece of binding legal text? And that's where, as I was saying, some of these other ways in which we can evaluate the seriousness of a company's due diligence approach, we think can really help in strengthening the law and making sure that we don't go too far towards what's easy, contract audit plans, and not also too far towards what's sort of vague and fuzzy, like the nature of the relationship.
May I just add something on contracts?
Yes, Alexander, go.
Stephen, is that okay? Because I'm not a lawyer by training, but so let me make the plea for contracts. We also very happy to work with the STAR Network and the STTI. So those are the organization. I think also with the GIZ support that have that represent manufacturers in many garment producing countries, and they've gotten together. I think probably you've maybe done a previous workshop or a newsletter item about this. You've gotten together and worked on commercial conditions. So what are the crucial elements for good contracting between buyers and suppliers? And that is something that we're also integrating in the common framework for responsible purchasing practices that are from the brand side. So we're telling brands, okay, this is responsible from your side, and that includes, you know, contracting that is acceptable to suppliers, that is conducive to shared responsibility and to you know, working on human rights and environmental issues together. And in fact, there is a platform called The Industry We Want, where, you know, it's really just a platform. People come together there. That's also where the common framework originated. People come together there around, let's say, common language and common tools. When we want to talk about living wage or whatever important topic, what are we actually talking about? What are the different concepts and what are the different metrics that can be used for that? So you mentioned, Stephen, and also Rachel, purchasing practices. How can you measure them? How can you actually say it's good or bad, or how do they progress? You know, one of the collaborations there is with the Better Buying Institute, where manufacturers just, you know, in very honest surveys tell you how you're doing. But of course, there are more things. But contracts is a part of that. It's a basis. It's not. It's the ground level. The rest of the building needs to be in a relationship. I completely agree. But it's also good to mention those efforts.
Well, I'll just stay with you here, Alexander. It was mentioned earlier how the pandemic really brought a great deal of public awareness of the problems between retailers and brands and their suppliers in the supply chain, with the regular headlines, certainly during 2020 and into 2021 and beyond that, of manufacturers had completed orders, they had invested sometimes huge millions of dollars in producing containers worth of shipping containers worth of clothes, and now they were sitting on a dock in Bangladesh or on a truck somewhere, and a retailer back in Europe or North America or elsewhere was refusing to pay for it or was demanding a wild discount. And not only was all profit gone, but the supplier was staring down the barrel of a significant loss. Now, one of the things that interests me about that is that whenever I follow Fair Wear on Twitter, and I regularly see tweets from Fair Wear about your brand checks.
Yeah,
and I'm familiar with a lot of the brands that are part of the membership of Fair Wear. And the pandemic wasn't the best time for the industry, right? A lot of the ugly side of the industry came out for public airing. But I think amongst Fair Wear members, the members getting the brand check, quite a few of them stood out with good purchasing practices, and I wonder if you can tell us something about that. I'm not necessarily asking for specific brands to be named. But I think there's a story here to be told that brands can do purchasing well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. It's an interesting question. It really relates also to what we've been talking about the past hour. Because it really sees on the mutual benefit of good relationships, and the story has a sort of an interesting ending in many cases. So yes, for some of us, it seems already a long time ago, but in that beginning of the pandemic, there were panic reactions, and some of them really, really bad, of buyers canceling orders that had already been produced, refusing to pay, or indeed asking for wild discounts to accept the order that they had placed themselves. So there have been really horrible examples of that. There have also been good examples. I think some of our brands indeed have done a good job, have even continued to pay, not directly, but to first of all, not canceled orders. That was very important. Not ask for discounts, very important. We would have also dealt with them very differently if they had. But even gone as far as to work with their suppliers to continue the payments to workers when the factories were in lockdown. And partly this has to do with this extreme price competition and fragmentation, where you can, basically on the one hand feel that you have to panic because you're already working on too thin margins, and then do this kind of crazy thing. And on the other hand, also feel you can do it because if this supplier is angry with you, you just go to a next one. So that's really some of the things that I alluded to in the beginning, the typical characteristics of our sector. But there's also another side to the story, because when shops opened again in Europe and people needed their stuff, it was the better buyers, we call them that way, that actually got it. And we have several CEOs and CFOs of important brands on record saying we're really, really happy that we had these good relationships with our suppliers, because now we are the first to get our products while the shelves are empty at the neighbors. And this, I think, shows that today you're in trouble, tomorrow maybe I'm in trouble. We need each other to have a sustainable business.
Okay, I'm just looking at the time. I want to get to the sort of the second major theme of this event, which is worker voices. How supplier voices, not losing track of title use. Yeah,
Both are
suppliers have a voice. Now, what if you could outline some of the ways in which suppliers are able to get their voices heard, particularly in the EU? We did have a speaker planned today from the US, but unfortunately they weren't able to follow through with attending today. So we're just on the EU, because you're both based in Europe, but I think EU. What avenues are there open to Asian-based suppliers in getting their voice heard in Brussels on these issues, on purchasing practices, due diligence? I'll go to Rachel first.
Sure. I mean, maybe my comments are going to be a bit more general in nature, because I think what we're actually seeing is that many of the concerns that we've been talking about today are relevant to other sectors and to other stakeholders. And so I think that creates opportunities, frankly, for how to get them taken seriously in the coming process. But I just wanted to say a word about what that coming process is, again, for those who aren't following this on a daily basis. So now that the Commission has put its proposal forward, we enter into the formal EU lawmaking process, which involves also the EU Parliament and the Council of the EU. So that's the member state representatives. And they essentially enter into what they call trilogue negotiations. So the Commission, the Parliament and the Council, in order to settle on a final text. And it's very normal that there will be several iterations of this directive. It will get, readings in Parliament, it will get debated in the Council amongst the member states, and then finally we'll get to presume we'll get to a final version. I think the best assessments are that it's going to take until at least the first half of next year to get to a final version. And that it's likely that a version will be passed under the Swedish presidency of the Council of the EU. So that's in the first half of next year. So that's, means that the second half of this year is going to be a really important period where debate and advocacy and, opportunities to influence certainly the public discussion in the Parliament, but also the discussion amongst governments in the Council will be very important. And that's why I say that I think it's worth thinking about others who are already in this debate, who share some of the same concerns. And those include some of the sustainability focused associations that Alexander already mentioned, that do have a strong presence in Brussels, and that are, engaged in the debate. So Amphori is one, the Responsible Business Alliance is another, AIM is another. Again, they're organizations that have been trying to increasingly align their expectations of members with the international standards. So they have a similar, I think, investment in these issues. But also the governments, right, that are going to be negotiating amongst themselves. I mean, there are several governments that are, and, we mentioned before the relevance of GIZ's role. There are several governments, including the German government, but also the Swedish, the Dutch government, that are really focused on the connection between due diligence and better outcomes for people in key production and manufacturing countries. We hope to be doing some work on this ourselves at Shift in the second half of the year and looking at how to bring these issues more into the debate. But I think there are governments who need to hear this message, meaning they need to, of course, they will be hearing from their domestic business constituencies, but they also need to hear from businesses and workers and impacted communities in the countries that are going to be affected by this legislation. And several of them, I think, are very open to these arguments and concerns. And of course, there are NGOs and trade unions, actually, who want to see exactly the same kind of attention to purchasing practices as we've been talking about today. They know that the command and control model, the policing model, is broken, it doesn't work, and we need more collaborative and long-term engagement-based approaches. So there's a number of other players who are already positioned and active in this of more or less, decision-making authority that I think will be open to, or should be open to, these arguments.
I'll just jump in here, just remind people of something I said earlier on, that we would have a short survey, on a poll feedback form. The IT team has put a link into the chat box, so if you can please take a minute of your time just to click on that link and give us some feedback so we can improve these. Alexander, did you have anything to add on this question of suppliers being heard in Brussels?
Thanks. I completely agree with what Rachel's saying, and I think there's some promising new things going on as well that she mentions. So let me mention a few things. First of all, on lobbying, we need to improve on the proposal. So lobbying has been going on. For those of you who think lobbying is a dirty word, I don't believe so at all. It's just people with opinions getting together and trying to voice those opinions and trying to improve the law from their perspective. Now, the interesting thing is, and Rachel mentioned this before, some of the key points that need to be improved are actually broadly shared within our industry, at least, from left to right. So it's good that the Commission understands, well, how problematic concepts like established business relationships are. So that's one thing. I think we need to band together there because, as I said, because they are so widely shared, it's also important that the Commission understands that it's not just, big brands or Western points of view that support this, but also, let's say, the manufacturers. So if from Europe to Asia and everything in between, we stand together on some important points, then I think we can really have some influence on the Commission. And actually, what we've done is we've together with some of the organizations I mentioned, membership-based organizations like Amfori and SAC and ETI, we've written a letter about this to the EC, which will be published later on. But now it's been it's in their system, in their lobby system. And this was also signed by more than half of the important producer associations producing garments. So I think they represent over 60% of the production for Europe, and I know that has a voice as well. And I think those manufacturers organizations with some political influence in their own countries should also talk to their governments and talk to trade unions and say, hey, can we sit together and tell the European Commission what we think is wrong with the current proposal and how it can be improved. And they're very welcome to also contact us about the particular points that we already have agreement on. Now, on a little bit of a, so that's a meta lobbying level, but then why manufacturers' voices are important too is that when you do human rights due diligence, you need to start with good risk assessment, as Rachel already showed. So a good risk assessment also includes audits. Yeah, for lack of a better word, I see some comments in the chat as well about audits. Yes, audits should be part of risk assessments, but there should be much less of them, and there should be much better ones. So an initiative like SLCP, a Social and Labor Convergence Project, where the idea is to reduce audit duplication, I think is a very good initiative. Audits are part of risk assessment. They're not the risk assessment. They are part of it, and they can be an extremely important source. But there are many other sources. And both manufacturers, but also labor rights organizations, and certainly trade unions, need to be involved in assessing the validity of the sources, in assessing also the prioritization of the findings. Because often, I think we know very well what the outcome of an audit is going to be. We do an audit in a factory, in a certain region, certain type of product. We already know what the number 1, 2, and 3 risks are going to be. But are those necessarily the risks that workers also want us to work on? And very often they're not. So worker and manufacturer validation and prioritization are an integral part of what I think should be the future of audits and of risk assessment.
Thank you. Eigenstetter in the chat box has asked, could you please write the initiative in the chat box? I presume Eigenstetter is asking for the initiatives that Alexander has just mentioned. I think, Alexander, you've got a helper doing stuff in the chat box, who could probably do that. I want to go back.
Yeah, I don't know exactly which initiative that would be, but
I think you mentioned Amphori. I think you mentioned
the lobby initiative.
ETI. I think you also mentioned the initiative for
the
stop
FLCP, maybe
duplication.
Social labor convergence project. Yeah, that one. Okay.
Yeah, social labor convergence.
I'll do that. Go on, Stephen. Got it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to a question from Samir. EU draft legislation and due diligence is mainly applicable for large companies, and it misses out the informal and smaller companies where unprotected workers are left unprotected. Is there a way is there a way to protect those vulnerable workers and other groups? Who wants to have a shot at that? Rachel, I saw you gave a link to something. Maybe you could explain what's in the link that you posted in answer to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great point. And this is something that I think a lot of people are concerned about with the legislation. That the scope, as I said, is really focused on very large companies with specific definitions. And that parallels what's going on in around sustainability reporting at EU level as well, where indeed, there's been pretty heated debate about whether that should be extended to other companies. I think when it comes to what we're talking about here, which is the due diligence action, which underlies or should underlie reporting, of course, the expectation is that, as I said, in the international standards, that all companies do this, but that all companies do it in a way that is adapted to their risk profile, meaning their human rights risk profile. And so that's, we've worked with a number of SMEs over the years, and the resource that I put in the chat box is a short piece that my colleague Francis West wrote about what SMEs really need when it comes to due diligence is flexibility, which is what the international standards give them. It recognizes they don't have, of course, the same resources as large companies, but they can be connected to very severe risks. And so what they need to do is prioritize those very severe risks and find reasonable ways, again, based on their size and their ability, but reasonable ways to engage on them. And we have a number of examples of SMEs doing that. This is not hypothetical. What I think, again, what is challenging in the legislative debate is this sense that if we just go towards these kinds of measurable things, like you have to have a very heavy system of contracts and audits, and you're constantly checking everybody, as Alexander said, for predictable issues, whether or not they're the most severe issues from a worker's perspective, then that essentially can become a really resource intensive, heavy burden. There's another question that going to that in the chat box as well. And that can be overwhelming for SMEs, but that's not actually what due diligence is about. It's not about a one-size-fits-all heavy process. It's about a risk-based, risk-to-people-based, adaptive process that is proportionate to the nature of those risks and recognizes that different companies are in different positions with different resources. So I think we have some good examples of what's possible. I'm sure there's others on this call. I mean, there's others in the STAR Network membership, I'm sure, and within Fairware's experience as well. I think it's still an open question how the scope of the legislation is going to be defined. I mean, many people have made the point that SMEs are going to, by definition, and the draft legislation makes this point, SMEs are going to be affected by it. They may not be subject to civil liability under it, but they are going to be affected. So how do we take their situation and perspectives properly into account in designing it? Again, I think that's something that is going to be extremely important in the coming months.
as you say, there's a related question in the chat box indicating, look, many purchasing contracts are heavy with certificates. Buyers are using so many certificates and voluntary initiatives. Buyers, suppliers, and consumers are complaining. All that costs money. There's fees. There's so on and so forth. Could a harmonisation? Could there be some form of harmonisation on the basis of ISO, other international standards, UNGC, OECD, help to create more impact as resources can be used more effectively? Some brands are even demanding that suppliers follow own individual certification schemes.
Well, if I may, Stephen.
Yes, go ahead.
So first of all, certification just doesn't work. I mean, certification meaning something is good or bad, or it is like this, it's different from day to day, just to mention one thing. So the day that you send your reporters in, you find something else the next day. Even if everybody is being honest, every day is a different day, right? So and then there are millions of other issues with certification. We should never say that a company is good or bad. We should never say that a brand is good or bad. We should never say that, so we should always work on continuous improvement. That's also, I think, a concept very closely linked to due diligence. It's proportional, it's risk-based, it's focusing on improving things and reducing risks, rather than saying, okay, I am now a responsible company, I have no problems in my supply chain whatsoever. Everybody knows that that is absolutely impossible. So the reliance on certificates is not a good thing in any case. And certainly the reliance on a multitude of certificates is making it even worse. So again, some things can be useful in good audits, but it's part of the sources. If you know, for example, that a certain product comes with a very high risk of, let's say, chemicals versus people, so health and safety risks, you know that based on the product, right? You're not going to wait for a factory audit to see whether that is an issue. It is an issue. It is a risk. Of course, you want to see what the factory is doing with that and what the client is doing with that in the specifications. But yeah, that's a different position of audits, and that would hopefully reduce also this approach, this risk-based approach, would hopefully, if you do it well, reduce the perceived need for all this this multitude of different certificates.
Rachel, last word from you. A brief and succinct last word, if you'd like.
Just to say that I think it's really important that more people in Brussels are aware of the work that has been done through networks like this and through initiatives like this, and that the aim is to get better legislation at the end of the day. Better legislation meaning legislation that is more likely to deliver outcomes for workers and other affected stakeholders in line with the international standards. So just to say, from the Shift side, we're certainly happy to be in touch, and to Alexander's point, lobbying in favour of legislation that is going to get to better outcomes for workers, I think is constructive lobbying. And so long as it's transparent, I hope other stakeholders will see it the same way.
Yes, and not to be confused with the other sort of lobbying that we often hear so much about. Thank you for joining. Just a reminder, if you could please look in the chat box to fill out a feedback form. It's just a little survey. It'll only take you a minute to do. It would be very helpful for us. One of my key takeaways from today is, just in the summarizes, is really the absolute necessity of relationships, of building good, solid relationships built on trust and respect going both ways. This is our second series of online seminars. We did a a previous series beginning in 2020 when, you know, the pandemic first broke out, and it was entitled "Getting Through the Crisis Together." And during those online seminars, the topic that came up time and time again was the need for better relationships. And once again today, really a lot of this, yes, better legislation, but at fundamental level, we're looking for better relationships. Better relationships comes up over and over again in these events. My thanks to both speakers, to Rachel and Alexander, without whom none of this would be possible. If you could just share with me, put your hands together virtually.
Thanks for having us.
For our two speakers. Thank you very much. It just remains for me to say thank you, all the attendees, for coming. We appreciate you joining us and helping us to make these better and better for you. So to everybody, stay safe, take care. Thank you.